Hi everyone, I'm Kyle Bechet, and this is the AAF Exchange, a podcast from the American Action Forum, where experts provide clear, data-driven insights into today's economic and domestic policy issues. Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. What game are you missing tonight?
Bengals and the
No T. Higgins
Ravens
tonight. Ooh, that's a good game.
It's a good
tonight.
game. It's an important game.
I might actually watch tonight's Thursday game for the first time in a while.
What do we root for? Injuries.
Oh, you're right. This is divisional.
These are two divisional rivals, and we root for injuries.
Right. Yeah. See, I don't have to worry about football this weekend because
You don't have to worry about football for the rest of the year. You're
true.
done. Yeah. Good grief.
I did pick up Bailey Zappi in one of my leagues just to stash on the bench just in case, because I think Mac Jones is done. I think he's lost the locker room.
Yeah, could have. That sounds plausible. Nice tie, by the way.
Thank you. Out of every time, of the many, this is what, episode 135, and you're just now realizing that I don't wear ties to this?
I just finally got in touch with my inner feelings about it.
Fair enough. Let's jump into it.
I just did.
Let's jump into the podcast. On this episode of the AAF Exchange, the latest economic news, Congress's Stopgap funding measure, and new research on the earned income tax credit. Joining us is AAF's Douglas Holtz-Eakin, and later on, Gordon Gray. Doug, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Always a joy to be with someone in a nice tie.
You know, that the beginning part will probably make it in as our little banter beforehand.
Just making sure.
But I'm glad that you again brought it up. And I know that's not what's on the top of your mind, but I know that is on the top of your mind, but it shouldn't be the only thing on the top of your mind. So why don't you tell us what's on your mind today? I'm
currently enraged about digital discrimination, which is an initiative by the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. They have adopted the disparate impact standard, which means that if you do a broadband project, it has to have equal outcomes for everybody. For African Americans, whites, Hispanics, NFL fans, NBA fans, golfers, tennis players, Hispanics. Every dimension, it's got to be the same, which is just ridiculous. So this is a ridiculous standard taken at face value. And what happens if you're asked to adhere to a ridiculous standard? You don't play. Mm-hmm. And so this is a great way to inhibit broadband expansion and to cripple broadband pricing. It's a way for the FCC to basically command and control the entire internet, which is not broken, but they're going to break it either here, or they'll break it in net neutrality, or they'll break it in both places. But what's really galling about all this is they know they're doing it because they exempted the projects that are under all the big infrastructure bill and special digital divide funding. So they have this big BEADS program, and they say, well, if it's a BEADS thing, no, this doesn't apply, but anywhere else it does. So they know it doesn't work. They know it's a bad idea. They're going ahead anyway.
Yeah, so this was born out of the bipartisan infrastructure bill. A lot of people, obviously both sides sort of supported this legislation, and then now the problem is coming how the FCC is interpreting some of the statutes.
It's worse than that.
It's worse than that.
There's the infrastructure bill. Mm-hmm. There was then just broadband money in this BEADS program, which is a successor, just standalone. There have been several swaths of money put out there for broadband expansion to close the digital divide, make sure everyone has access to high-speed internet. Great. This is a separate thing. The FCC has just decided they are going to have digital discrimination rules for the internet.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
And so it's coming in from left field, literally left field, and it makes no sense. It's going to be at odds with what they want, which is to get broadband to people in an effective and affordable fashion. So
interesting.
So shoot yourself in the foot.
Well, on that note,
I'm good. I'm not upset at all. We have to get equal outcomes between listeners of our podcast and non-listeners too.
Right,
so they better check that.
Yeah, right. Oh, yeah. We'll definitely get right on that. You wrote about this in your dish this morning. So, or was it this morning?
It was a while back.
It was sometime this week, I think.
I'm glad to see it was memorable.
Yeah. But so on that happy note, should we talk about the economy?
Sure.
So let's start with, where we usually start when we're talking about the economy, and that's inflation right now. This week, CPI report showed that inflation was flat for October. Cue the celebrations.
Yeah. I mean, we saw the financial market's response.
Right, exactly. So what do you make of this report?
So it's easy to figure out the report. If you want to know what's going on with top-line inflation, look at what happens with the energy prices. The energy component of the CPI fell at an annual rate of over 37% in October. And that explains why the top line came in flat and why the year-over-year moved down to 3.2%. If you want to know what's going on with core inflation, you just got to keep track of what's going on with shelter. Shelter inflation in the month of August was 3.2% annual rate. In September, it went to 7.2, went back to 3.2. So we saw the core come down to 4 year over year. But that means the core is at 4, which is twice the target, and so we're not done.
Right.
But there is steady progress, albeit at a pretty slow rate.
Yeah, so I mean, I saw a lot of some of the reporting around this was, home price or rent and home prices went up, so that was sort of concerning. And then there were some food prices that went up, and then of course, I think used cars was the other one that went down, which was kind of nice to see.
So there are a couple of things about people's response to the inflation issue that are interesting, right? So if you look at food and gasoline, people don't want inflation to go away. They want the prices to go back to what they used to be.
Yeah.
And that would require actual deflation, and that's not really what the Fed's aiming for. And so there's a continual disappointment that the food prices are not what they were 3 years ago.
Right.
That's baked in the cake at this point.
Yeah.
That's one thing. The other is that people tend to focus on one price or another when in fact inflation is by definition the broad increase in the price level, and so they mistake those two a lot. And then you just have to acknowledge the fact that the inflation takes a long time to get rid of it, and we're just coming to grips with that. One of the other things to keep an eye on is economists like the core, because it gives you the best predictor of where the overall inflation rate, the top line, is going to be a couple years out. But people don't pay the core; they pay the whole CPI, and so they get the break when the energy prices go down. They're happy about that, and they get furious when the food prices go up. They're unhappy about that. So you do have to keep track of that. Like I always look at food, energy, and shelter.
Yeah.
That's still going up well over 4%. So it's above the trend still, and people are paying that, and they don't like it.
Yeah. Now I can put a feather in my cap because I got you to talk about food on the podcast. So.
Oh my. Our standards have gone sub-zero.
So what about the Fed on all this? You mentioned they're watching this closely. What's their next move?
Their current mantra is higher, longer. So they're going to keep rates higher than people had thought they would have to, at 5.25%, and longer than people might expect. And if you look at markets, they're always pricing in a cut in the federal funds rate somewhere 3, 4, 5 months out. So I think that means the Fed just stays on what appears to be hold, because they're not moving the federal funds rate. But remember, they're still tightening the portfolio. Right? They're running that $5 trillion of increase in the portfolio that went on in the pandemic. They've gotten rid of $1.2 trillion of it, and they're continuing to go. So that's going to continue to tighten financial conditions. And it is true that for every interest rate, as the inflation rate falls, real interest rates are going up. So they're sort of in a very passive way tightening all the time still.
Okay, what about earlier this week? In your Dish column, you contemplated the question: has the Fed cooled the labor market? What was your takeaway there?
I think the answer is unambiguously yes. There are a bunch of different ways to look at it. I wrote one short piece on the so-called SOM rule. Claudia Somm said that if you look at the 3-month moving average of the unemployment rate, if it goes up 0.5 percentage point above the previous low in the unemployment rate, that's the predictor of a recession. Well, we're at 0.4, so by that measure, the labor market's cooling. If you look at actual jobs plus job openings, so that's jobs we'd like to staff, that's a measure that's come down dramatically. And the growth in jobs we'd like to have is down to 1.7%. It was 1.3 before the pandemic. So we're getting back to sort of more normal labor market conditions.
Yeah, and then I think the retail sales numbers came out today too that further suggest that people are starting to save money in anticipation.
My take on the economy is not as optimistic as a lot of people. And, if you just start with the most recent GDP report, 4.9%, everyone gets all excited. That's a very big number. 1.3 percentage points of it is inventory, so that's transitory. It's going to get leveled out. Another 0.8 is government spending, so that's Bidenomics in action. So now you got 2.8 percentage points of growth that have come from the private sector. 0 come from non-residential investment. So equipment, intellectual property, non-residential structures, flat, dead flat. That's usually a bad sign for the economy. And the household sector, of course, is spending like mad. Everyone's all happy about that, but the savings rate has plummeted in recent months, and credit card debt's ramping up. And so you do have to wonder how long will it last. And today's retail sales report says maybe in October things really did flatten out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see as we get into the holiday season if that changes. And if it's, I know it's adjusted, but
yeah, this is where I think we've had the most trouble. Post-pandemic is in seasonal adjustment. Mm-hmm. What is a normal buying pattern around the holidays anymore? Who knows?
We're going to see Black Friday sales. We're going to see Cyber Monday.
We're having pre-Black Friday sales now.
Yeah, I noticed that. I got a few emails.
So what does that do? Literally to the monthly data. If it's all showing up in November now instead of none of it in December.
Yeah. I'm keeping my eye out for some good deals out there this time, but we'll see if that pans out. So what does the current state of the labor market, you said you're not as optimistic about the future of the outlook of the economy, not the future, but what are we in recession watch? What is the potential of a recession in 2024?
I'm in recession watch, and I think the probability of a recession in the next 6 months is over a half. I think we're still, I thought that was true of the fourth quarter. Looks like I'm probably wrong, but I think the fourth quarter is on track to go from 4.9 in the third quarter down to something like 1.5 to 2 in the fourth quarter. It's flattening out, and I worry about early next year. I do.
Interesting. Well, we'll have to. Well, I'm sure you'll be back on to talk about that as we put the economy behind us in this podcast for now. But should we do some trivia before I let you go?
Oh, why not?
I know it's your favorite section. So, all right. So, by what? So this is some research that Tom Lee did. Okay. So it's in trade. What percentage does our own Tom Lee estimate that revoking China's permanent normal trade relations would decrease total exports?
13%.
17.4%.
I bet it's the 10% tariff paper. I got the papers confused.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah.
It's a big deal.
So yeah. It's pretty timely since the president is meeting with Xi Jinping in California right now. So it's very. I think it says a lot about the global economy that in what they're talking about.
Yeah, I think that's an extreme version. It also hurts the U.S. economy pretty dramatically. So I'm not a big fan of this as a policy, but in general, we are walking away from trade. The administration had just a disastrous move, in my view, with the U.S. trade representative saying we're no longer going to support at the WTO these provisions that are going to stop countries from doing data localization or forcing you to deliver your source code. And there's all sorts of intellectual property problems there, and they're interfering with digital trade in a tremendous way. Well, that is the future, and so we're really just backing off something that's essential for success.
Interesting. Yeah, I hope maybe there'll be something that comes out of this to turn turn things around. But this has been happening since the previous administration. It's been this slow slide against decoupling the economies.
It's been going on for a long time. I'm now officially old, and but I remember in 2001. So we're talking 22 years ago. When I was working at the White House, we were able to get trade promotion authority for then President George W. Bush by one vote in a Republican-controlled House of Representatives. Trade has been a contentious issue for a long time in the U.S.
Interesting.
And we're seeing it.
Interesting. Well, we'll have to see how it continues to play out. I'm sure it'll be a hot topic on the campaign trail next year, so we'll be talking about it again.
Yes.
So thank you. We're going to bring on Gordon now, but thanks, Doug, for coming on and talking about all the economy and all this other fun stuff.
My pleasure.
Let's now bring in AAF's Vice President for Economic Policy, Gordon Gray. Gordon, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
So how have you been? It's been, you've been following some things, but, it's been a couple of weeks.
Yeah, I've been just peachy. Looking forward to the Las Vegas Grand Prix this weekend.
Oh, yes, I forget that's what's going on.
And I gather the federal government will be open. So that's great, too, I'm sure.
Yeah, let's talk about this. This week the House passed a so-called laddered continuing resolution to keep the government funded. The Senate is likely to follow suit, and the president will probably sign it to avert that government shutdown. First, just explain to us how this laddered CR works, because I don't think there's a lot of us that are familiar with it.
It's no more simple than a CR with two different expiration dates. Essentially, continuing resolution is essentially a shorthand approach to legislating, which is they draft a piece of legislation that more or less says legally, legislatively, okay, the 12 appropriations acts that are embodied in the last continuing resolution, we'll just change the dates on that CR, and instead of changing one date, which is to say moving the expiration date that was to be the end of this week to some date in the future, they got clever and they said, what we're going to do? We're going to, instead of one expiration date, we're going to have two. That's all it is. The rationale is that to the extent that you've more or less split the Funding Act into two different deadlines, that this will somehow preclude being jammed by the Senate or being stuck with, as has often been the case in history, sort of a 1,200-page last-minute bill that is essentially all 12 appropriations acts, the bills that fund the government, and they got to do it in the middle of the night and nobody reads it and stuff. It's not obvious to me why having two expiration dates precludes that. That outcome is a function of Congress not doing their job, and eventually accumulated interest prevails over another, and that's how the omnibus typically plays out. Is it happens at the last minute and people are like, get me out of here.
Unless I had the wrong date, they did move it past the holiday season.
Correct.
So it's into early next year. So we're not. So there won't be this whole we want to go home for Christmas. We need to pass.
Correct.
This
yeah, they gave themselves a pass for the holidays. The expiration dates are interesting in that for a portion of the CR, basically four of the acts in that Congress is supposed to pass, 4 of the 12, they expire January 19th. And then for the remaining 8, they expire February 2nd. If you look at the House calendar, at least, is the 19th is a Friday, and then the House is out for the following week, and they come back a week later, and then that Friday is the 2nd.
Interesting.
So, we've seen this movie before. I think they're just kind of rearranging the deck chairs, but this was the deal they needed to keep the government open, so that's why we got it.
Good. We got past the government shutdown. We averted it. We don't have to deal with that for now. And that's something, I guess. But it still runs out early next year, as we were just talking about. What does Congress need to do so we're not in exactly this situation a few months from now? Is it passing those appropriations bills, or how do we get to a funded government and out of the crisis mode?
So the reason why they're able to strike these deals and have been is because, with the exception of costing then Speaker McCarthy his leadership position, there aren't any fights in these. They're not fighting over spending levels. They're not fighting over the stuff that you would fight over if you were actually legislating on fiscal policy or on policy writ large. part of the reason they can't pass these acts is because there isn't agreement, particularly certainly between the chambers, among Republicans, among Democrats. And so what a CR does is it just says, all right, ignore all that. To the extent that the government is open right now, keep it open. That's really all a CR does. It just basically says, whatever we're doing, keep doing it. It doesn't grapple with security needs. It doesn't grapple with any of the fiscal policy challenges that we have. And so that's why they are kicking the can down the road. And ultimately, the disagreements that they have are going to have to be reconciled at some point.
Right. Yeah, I mean, just from a logical standpoint, it seems like, okay, we have different priorities from year to year. I mean, what was true last year is probably not true for this year, so we should be having a better conversation about, okay, where do we want to put the money that we've appropriated here? You know, our security change, you know, last year we didn't have a situation as big of a situation in the Middle East, you know. The priorities for Ukraine and Russia change, and, you know, just looking at the security alone, but then, you know, there's all these other appropriations bills that and then, as you also mentioned, fiscal responsibility here. I mean, that's the big rallying cry for a lot of people saying we need to get our house in order, but it's not really, a CR is not really grappling with those.
Right. Let us recall that the House Budget Committee marked up a budget resolution, and it hasn't seen the light of day on the House floor. So they're going through all these motions and getting a case of the clevers with this laddered CR stuff. They have a process that was enshrined in the Congressional Budget Act of 1974, and it says, you know, has a nice orderly timeline, Section 300 of the Act, that says when you're supposed to do stuff. It's a roadmap, and they have a process, and they choose not to follow it. And so, and then they periodically and selectively pick fights and invoke fiscal responsibility, but no one's doing the hard work.
Yeah, I mean, we're still 8 years away from what is it? Is it 8 years still from insolvency in some of our?
So
bigger
we have,
problems?
you know, the trust funds for our two major health and retirement systems are now, you know, what used to be long-term problems is now near and medium-term problems. These programs are in and of themselves a financial threat to the beneficiaries to the extent that they are insolvent within the budget window, fundamentally. And no one in Congress is talking about it, and barely anybody, and certainly none of the likely nominees for the presidency appear to be at all interested or serious in dealing with this.
Yeah, I mean, it might be time to finally pass budget jail.
Yeah.
I know you and Doug love talking about budget jail.
I'm still perfecting the ledge text. Yeah. Never got that one on the floor when I was on the Hill.
All right. Well, I'm sure you'll be back on in January, and we'll be having the same conversation about shutdowns and budget funding, because something about, you know, history repeating itself. But before
that old chestnut.
Before you're on the podcast today, and I don't want to let you go before we talk about a piece you had out last week that I got, you know, some attention, and I think it deserves a little bit more attention because I think it's a pretty good piece on the
thanks, Hal.
on the earned income tax credit. You did some great research on that. Start by talking to us about the basics of the EITC. Nailed it.
Yeah, you did. All four letters.
And why it's important. Didn't even get them out of order, too. That's what I was most scared about.
I'll tell you. Firing on all four cylinders. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it. It was the EITC is a unique federal program, unique in that it was the first what's known as refundable tax credit. A refundable tax credit is kind of a unique animal in public finance in that it operates sort of on both sides of the budgetary ledger, which is to say, to the extent that as a taxpayer, you have a positive income tax liability. So at the end of the year, based on your income and applicable tax rates, if you owe the IRS money, or over the course of the year, then a refundable tax credit will at first reduce your tax liability, so it's a tax cut, getting tax credit fundamentally. And then if you have no tax liability, so think about lower income folks who, between this standard deduction and just relatively modest incomes, when all said and done, may not have a positive tax liability. A refundable tax credit then still sends them a check, basically for any amount sort of beyond their tax liability up to the maximum amount of the credit. And the design of the EITC is also geared toward incentivizing work. So it's called the earned income tax credit, to the extent that you get a credit for every dollar you earn in active work, and it ramps up. So for each additional dollar you earn up to a certain amount, you get a certain amount of a credit for that work, and then it plateaus, and then it starts to decline. And basically, the way that works is incentivizing work, right? So it's basically, if I worked another hour, I'd get even more money in terms of the income from the work, but also an additional amount in the earned income tax credit. So the way it's designed, we're asking it to do a lot of things. We're asking it to, at once, incentivize work, so get people in the workforce. It's providing just straight up anti-poverty effects. And all of these design features involve trade-offs. And so the paper looked at the evolution of the tax credit, sort of what its design is, how much it costs, how it's evolved, and then thinks about what tweaks could we do to sort of manage some of these trade-offs.
Yeah, and so in those those tweaks that you make, you mentioned in your piece that it hasn't really been touched, hasn't been changed since it was passed. I mean, it was some minor. It was like minor tweaks or stuff like that.
Fundamentally, like all things, sort of dollar amounts change.
Right,
and you've gotten, a little more generous, but the basic architecture. Has remained essentially the same.
So if you were advising policymakers, you're a ledge director on the Hill, how would you suggest they update this policy?
So one thing that is striking when you look at the EITC is that for childless adults, the credit is relatively modest. Essentially, the difference in having no children and one child, the credit is 6 times more generous with the addition of a child. Now, understandably, part of the goal of the program is to reduce poverty, and we rightly prioritize reducing poverty among families. However, it is the case that the childless EITC is entirely and relatively modest. So for about a third of all EITC claimants are childless. Not even 4% of the amount of the roughly $59 billion in 2020 in EITC payments. So a third of the claimants are only getting roughly 4% of the benefit, just because of the design. We want to talk about trade-offs here, because there are no free lunches, and so it would be costly to introduce parity or anything like parity with childless adults. And the research literature doesn't have an awful lot to say on how this population would respond. We know that single mothers, or that the EITC was. The literature's found a significant effect on encouraging mothers to work, and there's a real finding in the literature about how responsive that population was. We're less sure about how the childless population would respond. So to the extent that we are living in a world where we're bound by budgetary constraints, we just do need to weigh some of these trade-offs as we go forward.
Interesting. Well, it was a really good paper, and we'll make sure to include the link to it in the show notes so that people listening can go click and read it because it's a good paper. So thank you for coming on today to talk about that paper and also our ongoing watch of the federal government funding. I'm sure we will be back discussing hopefully a final passage.
My watch has not ended.
Your watch has not ended. I haven't heard that one in a while. But
That's right.
Thank you for coming on, Gordon. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Tune back in for our next episode, where our experts will provide clear, data-driven insights into today's economic and domestic issues. I'd also encourage you to check out any of the links in our show notes, and also follow us on social media to learn more about AAF. Don't forget to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or Google Play.